It's February. It is one of my favorite months. It's Black History Month. It is the month my father was born. It is when Valentine's Day takes place. And my husband and I are usually a little bit more intentional about expressing our love this month. But it's also a really important month for us because it is Congenital Heart Disease Awareness Month. You'll hear it by a bunch of different names. It's also Heart Health Month. I think this week itself is actually Heart Health Week. And so coincidentally, I have been really emotional the past month or so, since the new year, just thinking about Brandon, who's now 15, my firstborn, as I'm watching him thrive in high school and I'm watching him play on the varsity basketball team. He's excited about that. I've just been crying tears of gratitude recently. Just thankful for his life, his journey, his struggle, what it's taught him, what it's taught us, how it's made our family strong. But I also realize that we were going through some old pictures the other day, and Brandon was kind of taken aback when he saw one of his photos. It was him in a wheelchair. And he was like, "What's that?" Fortunately, it's been a few years since he's had a surgery. And so, we were like, "That was you when you had surgery a few years ago." He was like, "Oh, wow, really?" He just doesn't, he looks at himself now and he just doesn't connect with that image. And my husband and I were talking about, just everything we've been through with Brandon and his struggle. And, it was emotional for us. There's so much that we haven't talked about. There's so much that has impacted us as a couple, as a family. Um, and we have our own little, healing to do from this journey, but we're so grateful for the struggle. And so I don't know, I just felt like talking about it. So Brandon was, when he was 8 days old, we took him to the emergency room. The day before, he had lost an interest in nursing, so he basically stopped eating. We noticed that he was flaring his nostrils when he breathed, and also you could see here that there was some laboring happening when he was breathing. And so by the middle of the night, again, after not nursing, he wouldn't take a bottle. We tried. We called the advice nurse, and she said it's time to get him checked out. So we went to our local emergency room, and they were baffled by him because Brandon's oxygen saturations were very low. They put the oxygen probe on him, and there's like, whoa, there's no way that his oxygen is that low in his body. So they kept putting it on different places, his toes, different toes, his fingers, different fingers, and his oxygen saturations were low. That didn't mean anything to us at the time, but they asked us to leave the room and wait in the waiting room while they contacted the local children's hospital to see if they can get to the bottom of what was happening with Brandon. Immediately, they called the hospital, and the hospital recognized that this is a heart baby based on the symptoms, that something was happening with Brandon's heart. So my parents had now arrived at the emergency waiting room with us. A doctor came out and told us that our son was sick and that a transport team was coming, and they would be taking Brandon back to the children's hospital to figure out what was happening. They let us go back to the room where they were working on Brandon, and we weren't really prepared for what we saw. We thought, the baby that was in the condition that we left him in was going to be the baby that we saw. And the baby that we saw had tubes and lifelines coming out of his body. They created an incision in his wrist and also in his belly, to try to stabilize him and give him the nutrients that he needed to, stay well while they got him to the hospital. He had just tubes coming out of everywhere. The little cute Winnie the Pooh onesie that we brought him in, they had to cut it open so that they could access what they needed to. Upon first look at him, I remember Mitch just literally fell to his knees. This is a 6'4", 270-pound man, and I grabbed him to try to keep him up. But just the sight of this perfect child that we had created now just looked like a specimen on a table. It was hard. It was hard to watch and stomach. So we were able to follow the ambulance to the children's hospital. I don't even remember our conversation on the way to the hospital. I think it was just mostly tears and confusion. When we got to the waiting area at the children's hospital, a really nice doctor met us and told us that our son had some very complex heart conditions and that he would require open heart surgery. We asked him, okay, so he's got these things, just tell us, what do we need to do to fix it? And so he did say open heart surgery. So it turns out that Brandon had a hole in his heart, which is not that uncommon. A lot of times those things go away on their own, or they don't cause much of an issue. But he had a quite a large VSD, ventricular septal defect. He also had a coarctation of his aorta, so a narrowing of his aorta. In addition, he had transposition of the great arteries or the great vessels. So again, I'm no medical doctor, but unoxygenated blood was returning to the body and giving his body unoxygenated blood as opposed to the opposite. It should have been giving him oxygenated blood. So he wasn't getting any oxygen. He wasn't, we were able to go back and talk to the cardiothoracic surgeon that would be the one to do the work on Brandon. He shared with us that Brandon was actually declining really quickly and wasn't well enough for them to do the open heart surgery that needed to be done, but that there was something that they could do in the meantime to keep him stable and well enough until they could do the larger surgery. So to keep him comfortable, they wanted to sedate him, and they did. So it would be several days before we could really effectively hold Brandon and see his eyes. But right before they wheeled him in for his one of his surgeries or procedures, they let us come take pictures. We were able to see him. We were at his bedside all the time, but this was a big moment. He was going in for one of his first major procedures, and they allowed us to take pictures. Again, Brandon had been sedated for days. But they wheeled over his little hospital bed that they were keeping him in, and we prayed over him, and I just remember saying, Mommy loves you, and God has us, and I'll see you in a little bit when you get done with your surgery. And this little cute thing, he looked right up at me. He opened one eye. Again, I had not seen his eyes in days. But that was God, for him to open his eyes for the first time in that moment and look directly at me. It's like he was saying to me, Mom, I am good, and you're right, we have this. So that was beautiful, and that was the strength that I needed in order to wait for him, as he went through this procedure. So he made it through that, and while he was in the hospital, remember, he wasn't getting any oxygen. He developed some issues in his head. He developed fluid on the brain. He also had a grade 2 bleed in his head. And so I remember the cardiologist coming in, and you could see his energy and his vibe was just off. And you could see there was something happening that he wanted to share with us. And it wasn't just a visit to see how the parents were doing, given the fact that Brandon had just had this other surgery. He shared with us that, Brandon would most likely need a shunt, and that, the neurosurgeon would be coming to talk to us about this shunt thing. He was disappointed because he said, as a heart surgeon, he could fix the heart. He was like, we're heading in the right direction with the heart. But this little thing happening with his head could be very, very tricky. And so, our hearts just sank. What do you mean? We came in with a heart condition, which we didn't know about, 3 of them. And now you're saying that he needs to have neurosurgery. He needs to have surgery around the brain. Like, this was too much. This was too much to process. And so the neurosurgeon came in and shared what needed to be done and what Brandon would look like and be like after. And we're like, okay, we've got this. We can do this. The reason we found out that, he needed to have the surgery is because we walked in one morning and, we said to the nurse, like, something's happening with his eyes. He was looking ahead, but all you could see was the whites of his eyes. His eyes were what they call sunsetting. There was pressure coming from, the fluid and everything he had going in the brain that it was putting a lot of pressure on the back of his eyes. And so his eyes were sunsetting. So we went through that. All in all, we were in the hospital for 6 weeks. So from 8 days old, we were in the hospital for the next 6 weeks. My parents would come back and forth from the Bay Area to Central Valley, where we were living at the time. We had friends bring us clothes. My husband went home several times. We had a dog at the time, and so to make sure the dog was okay. But we stayed at that hospital every night, every day, every night. Some of the nights we actually stayed at the Ronald McDonald House. We had that place for 6 weeks, but most nights we didn't want to leave Brandon's side. We felt guilty for, there were some nights where the nurses said, "Mom and Dad, this is gonna be a journey. You guys have to go get some sleep." And we're like, we can't leave our, how are we gonna leave our son here? He's a baby. He's supposed to be getting love. We're supposed to be talking to him and loving him and nurturing him. But we did. Some nights we forced ourselves to leave the hospital and go get some sleep. And all night I would have to wake myself up every 2 hours to pump, because I was going to make sure that this baby was going to get my breast milk one way or another. So I would pump day and night. Even in the hospital, I would hold him and I'd have to say, "Here, honey, give him to Mitch," while I went and I pumped. They gave him my breast milk through a feeding tube, which I have to say was heartbreaking. I felt like I wanted to nurse him. I wanted him to be able to nurse, but they wanted him to preserve all of his energy for what he was going through. I fought them on that, I did, but at the same time, I was just glad that, he was able to get my breast milk some way. So while we were also in the hospital, we found out that Brandon had got MRSA, which is a terrible thing to catch while you're in the hospital. And so, that was just one more thing. Again, we walked in with something and walked out with all of these other crazy things. So it was time for us to go home. And again, by this point, Brandon is 7 weeks old, and they had tentatively scheduled a date for his open heart surgery. So again, he had a first heart surgery where they, were able to put in a stent or something to just sort of hold him over until he was a little stronger for the next surgery. He had his neurosurgery, surgery number 2. So we were about to embark on surgery number 3. And so we had scheduled the day before Thanksgiving, I think, or the day after Thanksgiving, I can't remember, for his open heart surgery. But while he was waiting from 7 weeks old to 4 months old, we had to just really make sure that he was protected. He couldn't get sick. He was in a vulnerable state. And so we stayed home. My husband had to go to work, but I stayed home with him every day. Our big event of the day was walking around the neighborhood, me taking a shower or, going outside to walk the dog. Those were our big events that we look forward to. When Daddy came home from work, we would be outside with the dog waiting. I mean, those were the things that we were able to do that made us excited, so that's what we did. The tricky part, though, was the doctors were concerned about doing surgery when Brandon had MRSA. And the dangers that came with that. If any of that bacteria got on any of the areas of his heart, what that could mean for Brandon. So they were cautiously optimistic that, we were going to be able to have this surgery around Thanksgiving. And I remember, as Thanksgiving grew closer, we went to the hospital every week. They would check to make sure that Brandon was not declining, his heart was still holding up, and that we didn't have to push up his surgery date sooner. But I remember, each time we went to the hospital, they would put the probe down his nose to see if he still had MRSA, and he did. And so again, they were like, okay, surgery was inevitable. If we didn't have surgery soon, things weren't going to be well for Brandon. So would you believe that it might have been 4 days before he was scheduled for surgery that he was cleared of MRSA. 4 days. So in all of his other appointments, he was still coming up positive for MRSA, but 4 days before his surgery, he was cleared clean for MRSA. So that was a miracle. Um, so surgery happened. He was 4 months old. So open heart surgery is what Brandon had. So again, they cut open his body right here, take his heart out, put it on a machine, and fix his heart. All the while, Brandon is on support machines to keep his body alive while they're fixing his heart. They put his new heart that's all fixed up back in his body and sew him back up. I can't even imagine that for an adult, let alone a 4-month-old little boy. And this is what Brandon went through. My mom and my best friend's mom came to stay with us for a couple days. They brought us food. Again, this is Thanksgiving when he had his surgery. So they brought us the best down home cooking that I could remember. And I remember my best friend actually before surgery. I think it was before this surgery. It was before one of his surgeries, but going into surgery was just as dramatic as I can remember it being in the movies. There's these big steel doors or whatever they look like, and it's a moment. Again, we were able to take pictures of him, and we were so scared. But I remember praying with my friend right before surgery. We were sitting on the ground, praying and singing songs from church from, when we grew up. And I remember, if there's been one time in my life when I remember God speaking to me so very clearly and showing how real he was, it was in that moment. And he said to me, Erin, I am going to return your son, and I'm going to return him whole. That was it. Done. Game over. That's all I needed to know. And I held on to those words through surgery, and I've held on to those words over the years. And those of you, again, who know us, you know that that third surgery, which we hoped would be the last, was not the last. Brandon's heart has been pretty amazing over the years, but this tricky head thing that the doctors were concerned about as being tricky for little kids has been tricky for Brandon. He has had 20 surgeries in his 15 years of life, mostly all to the head to repair the shunt. Sometimes the shunt would break. There were years that went by where the tubing would slip out of the ventricles, like they just couldn't get it in the right part of his ventricles. They would just move it over a millimeter, hoping that, it would work for him. And then 6 weeks later, we would be in the hospital again saying, he's not well, something is wrong. And then 2 weeks after that, he had just had a surgery. 2 weeks later, he's showing signs of just intense head pain. It was like his head was crushing together. How do you tell a 2-year-old? How do you relieve a 2-year-old of pain like that? I remember, we tried to put Brandon in preschool. We wanted him to have as normal of a life as possible. We tried to put him into preschool, and most days, thank God for my mother-in-law, we would be at work, but most days she'd have to pick him up from preschool because he was just in too much pain. He would be crying. He'd have intense headaches that I can only describe as a migraine. But again, imagine a migraine with a 2-year-old. They weren't migraines. They were actually all the pressure building up in his head and around his brain area, just causing him so much discomfort. But I remember having Chloe. They're exactly 2 years apart. They're both born in July. And again, we went through days, years, probably a solid 2 years where Brandon was in intense pain almost every day. We might have skipped 2 or 3 days, and we were so thankful for those days. When Brandon was feeling well, he would live it up. He would want to go shoot baskets. He'd want to go to the park. We were running around, spending all of our money, We just wanted our kid to be well. But I remember trying to be in the bed with Brandon, trying to close up all the curtains and keep him comfortable. But I also had baby Chloe, who was, 2, 3, 4, 5 months old, who needed my love and needed my attention. Um, I was trying to keep her happy and quiet and loved and keep Brandon comfortable. It was just, I just, those days were crazy. I remember, we would get so excited. I wanted to take the kids to Mitch's basketball game to watch the guys play, and we couldn't. Brandon would get sick and start, throwing up. Throwing up was a sign that, it was one of the signs that his shunt might be malfunctioning. So, he would throw up and have intense pressure in his head right before a game. And so I remember being so disappointed because we couldn't go watch Daddy's players play. Um, just so much stuff through the years. And again, some of his surgeries were back to back to back. All 20 of his surgeries were actually in the first 12 years of his life. Thank God he has not had a surgery since he's 12 years old. But this kid is the most resilient kid I've ever met. It's like God reached down and put his hands right on Brandon's shoulders and said, "You are mine." Um, Watching him through the years, be poked and prodded, and mind you, in these 20 surgeries, that's not to account for the times when, we went to the emergency room and we were told it was a false alarm, when in actuality it wasn't a false alarm. They just couldn't understand. Brandon didn't always look like the kid whose shunt was malfunctioning. They would do a CT scan and his ventricles looked closed. It didn't look like any fluid was building up, but Brandon had slit ventricles, they determined over time, and so he wasn't going to present like any normal kid. Um, I just, there were so many times, days, nights of tears and prayer. And one of the worst fears that you fear after having any kind of surgery is infection. And if you have a shunt in your body, you've got, tubing that goes into your ventricles, you've got a valve here, you've got 6 feet of tubing in your body. Again, without this mechanism, Brandon doesn't live. And our worst fear was that after one of these surgeries, that his shunt gets infected. Because we had talked about that, our surgeon was open about that. That was one of the reasons why, we were certain as parents that, his shunt's malfunctioning. We know it. These are the signs. These are the symptoms he's showing at home. But there would be this tug of war with the neurosurgeons because they had just done surgery on him like 2 weeks prior, and they just didn't understand how the tubing kept slipping out or it wasn't in the right place. And so I remember just thinking, and they shared with us, that we can't just keep going in here and trying to fish around to see if something's going on, because there is a high risk of infection. And I remember after one of the surgeries, Brandon started to develop a fever, and I told my husband, I'm like, we've got to go to the hospital. I feel like he's getting an infection. And again, for him to get an infection, they have to take his entire system out of his body, the system that he's relying on to live, basically. There's something temporary that they could do, but it's just bad news for him to be able to, for him to get an infection. And I remember, he has a fever. He had just had surgery, and I'm literally, I didn't even know that I could pray like that. I didn't even know that God and I were as good as we were. And Brandon was in his bed, and I laid next to him, and I just prayed over him, and I prayed and I prayed, and I just started to thank God for what I knew was happening, but I knew what God was able to do, that he was stronger than anything, that he was more powerful than anything that we were experiencing. And would you know, I took him to the hospital, and I laid hands on him, and I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. And when I say I pray all the time, but I prayed like never before. And my husband was just watching me like, I don't know what is going on in there, but yes, Lord, yes. And when we got to the hospital, his fever broke. And they were like, I don't know what to tell you, but we're just going to keep you here for observation, but he's looking good. And I know that we prayed that infection off of his body. I don't care if I sound like a crazy person. Um, if those of you connected to God know these kinds of things happen. And so through the years, I, I just, I'm so grateful for these struggles that we've gone through. Um, I have so much more empathy for just people going through things. I just want to encourage people going through tough times in their lives. I don't know how we made it through those 12 years. And I actually feel kind of funny even talking about how hard this was for me. My husband and I have had a really hard time talking about how hard this was for us, and that's why we don't talk about it. This was hard for us. This was hell for us on earth. Because this wasn't about us. This was about Brandon went through this. Brandon went through these struggles. And so again, we've hesitated to talk about the hurt and the pain and the questions that we had about, why and how, and we just did. We just kept moving forward. And so I just want to encourage anybody going through anything that soon whatever you're going through will be in the rearview mirror, and there are always lessons in every struggle that we go through. And it doesn't seem like it in the moment. I'm just so grateful that I had a heart that always turned to God. We had questions, but we always trusted that God was in control. And through each and every surgery, through the times when I thought Brandon had an infection, and the times when I thought, we literally cried and said, God, how much can one little boy take? He's poked and prodded all the time. And how much more can this little boy take? I held on to his promise. He checked me every time, and he said, remember my promise to you. And my promise to you was that I would return him to you, and I would return him to you whole. Yes, we have been challenged. Yes, our faith has been tested. And he's 15. I don't know what the future holds, but I will always hold on to that promise that God gave me, that he is going to return my son to me whole. So I don't know if this story is encouraging to anybody, but we all go through things in our lives, and we post, our highlight reels on social media, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Life is tough sometimes. And so, I look at my Instagram and my Facebook as, I want it to be a place where I can go back and be happy and excited about the things that I have in my life, and the blessings that I have in my life. And so, but I also think it's important to be real and share our struggles, because other people gain so much strength when we're brave enough to share our stories. And so this is just a little bit about our story, a little bit about Brandon's story. He truly is a miracle baby. I'm so grateful for him. Again, I'm grateful for every single thing that we've gained and that we've been taught through every challenging moment. So that's it.